Simone Lawrence stood frozen at the altar, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The man before her wasn't Druce, her handsome fiancé who'd swept her off her feet 6 months ago. Instead, an imbecile in tattered clothes grinned at her with vacant eyes. Across the crowded church, she spotted him, Druce, her supposed love, smirking coldly with another woman draped on his arm. 300 guests watched. Her family waited. The pastor cleared his throat. In that moment, Simone made the most insane decision of her life. One that would change everything forever. If you want to see how this impossible situation unfolds, keep watching and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The autumn leaves had been falling like copper rain that day in Detroit, painting the sidewalks outside the Somerset Collection Mall in shades of amber and gold. Simone Lawrence remembered every detail of that afternoon 3 months ago. How could she forget? It was the day her entire world had tilted on its axis, though not in the way she'd initially believed. She'd been 53 years old, single, and desperately trying not to feel the weight of those facts as she browsed through the designer section of Neiman Marcus. Her younger sister's wedding was approaching, and Simone needed something that screamed, successful career woman who's perfectly happy alone, even though her heart whispered different truths in the quiet moments before sleep. That's when she'd first seen him. Druce Hamilton had been everything a romance novel promised. 6 feet 2 inches of chiseled perfection, with sandy blonde hair that fell just so across his forehead, and eyes the color of a summer sky. He'd approach her near the perfume counter, his smile confident and warm. "Excuse me," he'd said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I couldn't help but notice you from across the store. That dress you're holding? It would look absolutely stunning on you, but honestly, you could make a paper bag look like haute couture." Simone had laughed, genuinely surprised and flattered. Men didn't usually approach her anymore. Not men who looked like they'd stepped off a magazine cover, anyway. She'd felt her cheeks warm, felt something flutter in her chest that she'd thought had died years ago. "That's quite a line," she'd responded, raising an eyebrow. "Do you use that on all the women in the perfume section?" "Only the ones who take my breath away," he'd countered without missing a beat. "I'm Druce. And before you think I'm some kind of creep, I promise I'm just a guy who knows beauty when he sees it and couldn't live with himself if I didn't at least try to get your name." "Simone," she'd offered, extending her hand. Simone Lawrence. What Simone hadn't known, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that this chance encounter was anything but chance. Just 2 weeks earlier, she'd attended a charity gala for underprivileged children in Detroit. There, she'd had an unfortunate run-in with a young woman named Melissa Hamilton, Druce's younger sister. Melissa had made a snide comment about the event becoming too diverse and questioned whether certain people really belonged at such an exclusive fundraiser. The remark had been directed at Simone with thinly veiled racism, delivered with a sugary smile that made it even more poisonous. Simone, who had built her career as a senior executive at one of Detroit's top marketing firms through sheer determination and brilliance, had not let the comment slide. In front of a circle of influential attendees, she'd calmly and eloquently dismantled Melissa's entitled worldview, pointing out that perhaps someone who'd inherited their way into society rather than earned it shouldn't question anyone's belonging. She'd done it with such grace and intelligence that by the end, Melissa had been red-faced and stammering, while several people had actually applauded Simone. Melissa had gone home furious and humiliated, and she'd done exactly what spoiled younger siblings do. She'd run crying to her older brother. "That woman embarrassed me, Druce," Melissa had wailed. "In front of everyone. You have to do something." Druce Hamilton, who'd made a career of manipulating people for his own amusement and had never been told no in his privileged life, had decided to teach Simone Lawrence a lesson she'd never forget. He'd find out everything about her, sweep her off her feet, make her fall desperately in love with him, and then humiliate her in the most public way possible. It would be poetic justice, or so he'd convinced himself. So the meeting at the mall hadn't been fate. It had been calculated cruelty dressed up as romance. Over the next 3 months, Druce had played his part perfectly. He'd courted Simone with an intensity that had made her dizzy. expensive dinners at the best restaurants in Detroit, weekend getaways to Chicago and Toronto, long conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. Listen to her stories about growing up in Nigeria, about immigrating to America at 25, about building a career from nothing. He'd met her small circle of friends and had charmed every single one of them. He'd even asked about her family back in Anambra State, expressing interest in her Igbo culture and traditions. For Simone, who had long since resigned herself to a life alone, it had felt like a miracle. After years of failed relationships and heartbreak, after watching friends and family members find their partners while she remained single, here was this incredible man who seemed to see her, really see her. Not despite her age, but because of everything she'd become. When Druce had proposed to her at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Detroit River, Simone had cried tears of joy and disbelief. She'd said yes without hesitation, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The wedding had been planned quickly. Druce had insisted they didn't need to wait, that when you know, you know. Simone had thrown herself into the preparations with enthusiasm, inviting everyone she knew. Her family from Nigeria had booked flights. Her colleagues, friends, and even some extended family members she barely spoke to had all RSVP'd yes. The wedding was to be held at a beautiful historic church in downtown Detroit, followed by a reception at one of the city's most elegant venues. The morning of the wedding, Simone had woken up in her apartment feeling like she was floating. Her bridesmaids, her sister Adiz, and two close friends had surrounded her with love and laughter as they'd helped her in her dress, a stunning ivory gown with delicate lace details that had cost more than she'd wanted to spend, but that made her feel like a queen. "You're glowing, Simone," Adiz had said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so happy for you. You deserve this." Simone had looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the radiant woman staring back. At 53, she was getting her fairy tale ending. Better late than never, right? The church had been packed when they'd arrived. 300 guests filled the pews, friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances, people who'd traveled thousands of miles to witness this moment. The flowers were perfect, cascading arrangements of white roses and lilies. The string quartet played softly. Everything was exactly as Simone had dreamed, except for one catastrophic detail. When Simone had walked down that aisle on her uncle's arm, her heart pounding with anticipation, ready to see Druce waiting for her at the altar with that devastating smile of his, she'd instead found herself facing a complete stranger. The man standing at the altar was not Druce Hamilton. This man was shorter, stockier, with unkempt hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. His suit, if you could call it that, was wrinkled and stained, at least 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like he'd grabbed it from a donation bin. His face bore a vacant, simple expression, and he was grinning at her with a childlike enthusiasm that would have been endearing in any other context, but was absolutely horrifying in this one. Simone had stopped walking, her feet refusing to carry her forward. The music continued to play. Every eye in the church was on her. She could hear confused murmurs rippling through the crowd. "Who is that?" someone whispered loudly. "That's not Druce," another voice said. "What's happening?" Simone's eyes had frantically scanned the church, searching for answers, searching for Druce, searching for someone to tell her this was some kind of terrible joke. And then she'd found him. There, sitting in one of the back pews on the groom's side, was Druce Hamilton. He wasn't in a tuxedo. He was in casual clothes, and draped all over him was a beautiful blonde woman Simone had never seen before. But worse than any of that was his expression. He was smirking. Actually smirking, with a cold, cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he watched Simone's world crumble. Their eyes met across the crowded church, and in that moment, Simone understood. This had all been a setup. Every romantic dinner, every sweet word, every promise of forever, all of it had been an elaborate, vicious prank designed to destroy her in the most public way possible. The pain that lanced through her chest was physical, stealing her breath. She felt her uncle's hand on her arm, steadying her as her knees threatened to buckle. "Simone," he whispered urgently. "What's wrong?" Should we stop this? Around her, she could hear the whispers growing louder. She could see her mother's confused face in the front row, her sister starting to stand up, concern written across her features. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, all watching, all waiting to see what she would do. And suddenly, Simone was back at that charity gala, standing in front of a crowd while someone tried to humiliate her, try to make her feel less than. She'd refused to be diminished then, and something fierce and defiant rose up in her now. She would not give Druce Hamilton the satisfaction of seeing her run. She would not let him turn her into a joke, a cautionary tale, a story people told about the desperate older woman who'd been so starved for love that she'd fallen for an obvious con. Simone straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked at the stranger at the altar. He was still grinning at her, seemingly oblivious to the chaos and confusion around him. There was something almost innocent about his expression, despite his disheveled appearance. "We continue," Simone said quietly to her uncle, her voice steadier than she felt. "What? Simone, no." "We continue," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I will not be humiliated. Not today. Not by him." And so, with every ounce of dignity she could muster, Simone Lawrence walked the remaining distance down that aisle and took her place next to a complete stranger at the altar of God. The pastor, an elderly man who'd seemed as confused as everyone else, had cleared his throat nervously. Shall we begin?" "Yes," Simone had said clearly, loudly enough for the whole church to hear. "We shall." What happened next would become the most surreal experience of Simone's life. The stranger, she later learned his name, was Sin-ho, had recited his vows with surprising sincerity, though his words were simple and his pronunciation often awkward. He'd looked at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen, with an earnestness that was almost painful to witness given the circumstances. When it came time for Simone to say her vows, she'd done so with her eyes fixed firmly on Sin-ho's face, refusing to look back at where she knew Druce was watching. She would not give him the satisfaction. "I, Simone Lawrence, take you." She'd paused, realizing she didn't even know this man's full name. Sin-ho Park, he'd supplied helpfully, his grin widening. "I take you, Sin-ho Park, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she continued, her voice only shaking slightly. "In sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as we both shall live." The words had felt like ash in her mouth, but she'd said them. She'd said them because the alternative, breaking down in front of everyone, giving Druce the victory he so clearly wanted, was unthinkable. When the pastor had pronounced them husband and wife, Sin-ho had leaned in to kiss her, and Simone had allowed it, closing her eyes and pretending she was anywhere but there. The reception had been torture. Guests had approached them with barely concealed confusion and curiosity, trying to figure out what had happened, why the groom had changed, where Druce had gone. Simone had fielded each question with a tight smile and vague responses, claiming there had been a last-minute change of plans and things working out for the best. Her family had been bewildered but supportive, though she'd caught her mother and sister having intense whispered conversations throughout the evening. Sin-ho, for his part, had seemed genuinely delighted by the whole affair, eating enthusiastically from the buffet and dancing with anyone who would dance with him, his movements awkward but joyful. Simone had spent the entire reception in a state of numb shock, going through the motions, cutting the cake, throwing the bouquet, all while feeling like she was watching herself from outside her own body. It was only as the reception was winding down, as guests were beginning to leave, and Simone was contemplating how she was going to explain to this stranger that their marriage wasn't real and would need to be annulled immediately, that things took another unexpected turn. A line of sleek black cars had pulled into the venue's driveway. Expensive vehicles, the kind that screamed wealth and power. Mercedes-Benz S, a Rolls-Royce, even a Bentley. Simone had watched, confused, as uniformed drivers had stepped out and opened the doors. From the lead car had emerged an elderly Korean couple, dressed impeccably in formal attire. The woman wore a traditional hanbok in rich burgundy silk, while the man wore a perfectly tailored suit. They moved with the bearing of people accustomed to respect and deference. Sin-ho, who'd been beside Simone near the reception hall entrance, had suddenly straightened up. The vacant expression had melted from his face, replaced by something sharp and intelligent. He'd smoothed down his ill-fitting suit and stepped forward. AMBW, he called out, his voice completely different from the simple, halting speech pattern he'd used all evening. Simone had stared in shock as the elderly couple had approached, and Sin-ho had bowed respectfully before embracing them. They'd spoken rapidly in Korean, too fast for Simone to catch even if she'd understood the language, and then the elderly woman had turned to Simone with a warm, genuine smile. "You must be our new daughter-in-law," she'd said in accented but perfect English. "I'm Mrs. Park, and this is my husband, Mr. Park. We are Sin-ho's parents. We have heard so much about you, Simone." Simone's mouth had opened and closed several times, no sound coming out. She felt like she'd fallen through a rabbit hole into some alternate dimension where nothing made sense anymore. Sin-ho had turned to her then, and the look in his eyes had been completely different from anything she'd seen from him all day. There was intelligence there, clarity, and something that looked almost like apology. "I think," he'd said quietly, his pronunciation suddenly perfect, "we need to talk." Behind them, following the elder Parks, had come more people, younger, dressed in expensive business attire, carrying themselves with the confidence of successful professionals. Simone had recognized the signs of wealth and power. She'd worked around it long enough in her career. The remaining wedding guests had watched this procession with open-mouthed shock. Simone had heard the whispers starting up again, louder this time, filled with confusion and speculation. "Who are these people? Did you see those cars? Is that stranger actually rich?" Simone had felt Sin-ho's hand on her elbow, gentle but firm. "Please," he'd said softly. "Let's speak privately." Still in shock, Simone had allowed him to guide her away from the crowd, his parents and the other arrivals following at a discreet distance. They'd made their way to a private room, the venue kept for such purposes, and once inside, with the door closed against the curious stares and whispers, Sin-ho had turned to face her. He'd taken a deep breath and begun speaking, and with each word, Simone's understanding of reality had shifted once more. "My name is Sin-ho Park," he'd started. "I'm the only son and heir of the Park Corporation, one of the largest technology and real estate conglomerates in South Korea, with significant holdings here in the United States. I am worth, personally, approximately $3 billion. Simone had sunk into a nearby chair, her legs no longer capable of supporting her. Sin-ho had continued, his voice calm but earnest. "This morning, when I woke up, I had the strongest conviction, a message from God if you believe in such things, or the universe, or my own subconscious. The message was clear. Today, I would find my wife. I was to dress as a homeless man, go to the church where I felt drawn, and wait at the altar. I was told that the woman who would walk down that aisle to marry me, despite how I appeared, despite everything suggesting she shouldn't, that woman would be my true wife." He'd paused, his eyes searching Simone's face. "I know how it sounds. Believe me, I struggle with it all morning. I have advisors, family members, a whole team of people who help me make decisions. But something about this conviction was so powerful, so certain, that I couldn't ignore it. So I did as I felt directed. I came to that church, I dressed in old clothes I found in a donation bin outside, and I waited. And then you walked down that aisle." Simone had finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is insane." "I know," Sin-ho had agreed. "But you need to understand something else. I've been wealthy my entire life. I've had people around me constantly, friends, partners, associates, and I could never be sure if they cared about me or my money. Every relationship I've ever had has been tainted by questions of motive. People pretend to love me, but they love my wealth, my status, my connections. Even my own extended family. There have been members who've stolen from me, who've tried to manipulate me for their own gain." He'd moved closer, kneeling down, so he was at eye level with Simone in her chair. "But you married me thinking I was nobody. Thinking I was, forgive the term, an imbecile with nothing to offer. You married me when it would have been far easier to run, to call everything off, to save yourself from whatever bizarre situation you found yourself in. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. I didn't marry you out of kindness, Simone had said, her voice bitter. I married you out of pride and spite. I was trying to avoid being humiliated by the man who was supposed to be my real groom. I know, Sinho had said gently. I saw him there, smirking in the back. I'm not an idiot, Simone. I could tell something was very wrong. But you still made a choice. Pride and spite are honest motivations. Far more honest than greed masquerading as love. Mrs. Park had stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on Simone's shoulder. My son has been searching for something real his entire adult life. If he believes God has brought you two together, I'm inclined to trust that. But more importantly, I trust my son's judgment. And from what I can see already, you are a woman of great strength and dignity. Simone had looked up at this elegant woman, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I don't understand any of this. This morning, I woke up thinking I was marrying one man. That man turned out to be a monster who orchestrated all of this to hurt me. And now I'm told I'm married to a billionaire who received a message from God? How is any of this real? Life rarely makes sense when we're in the middle of it, Mr. Park had said in his deep, measured voice. The pattern only reveals itself when we look back. Sinho had reached out, hesitating just before touching Simone's face, giving her the chance to pull away. When she didn't, he gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. We're strangers, and this situation is unprecedented. But I would like to offer you something, Time. Give us a chance. Give us a chance. Let's get to know each other properly. If, after some time, you decide this isn't what you want, I'll grant you the cleanest, most generous divorce you could imagine. But if there's even a small part of you that's curious about where this could go, then let's find out together. Simone had sat there in her wedding dress, in a room full of strangers who were apparently now her in-laws, processing the most bizarre day of her entire life. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that she should run, should get this insane marriage annulled immediately, should go home and pretend this entire nightmare had never happened. But there was something in Sinho's eyes, a sincerity, a vulnerability, a hope that gave her pause. And beneath her shock and confusion, there was something else too, a tiny, traitorous spark of curiosity about what might happen if she said yes. Okay, she'd heard herself say. Okay, we could try. Sinho's face had lit up with genuine joy, and for the first time all day, Simone had felt something other than pain and confusion. She'd felt a small flutter of something that might, possibly, eventually become hope. The next few hours had been a whirlwind. Sinho had asked if she was ready to leave the reception, and when she nodded, he'd helped her to her feet with such gentleness that it had made her throat tight. They'd emerged from the private room to find most of the guests had already left, though her family and a few close friends remained, hovering anxiously near the entrance. Sinho had walked with Simone to where her mother, sister, and uncle stood. Before Simone could figure out what to say, how to possibly explain what was happening, Sinho had addressed them directly. Mrs. Lawrence, I know this day has been confusing and distressing, he'd said to Simone's mother. I take full responsibility for the unusual circumstances. My name is Sinho Park, and I am now your son-in-law. I promise you that I will take care of Simone, protect her, and honor her as my wife. I know I must earn your trust, and I'm prepared to do so. Simone's mother, a formidable woman not easily impressed, had studied Sinho for a long moment before responding in Igbo, Ikwu, Eziakwu, are you speaking truth? To Simone's shock, Sinho had responded in halting but recognizable Igbo, Mama, Ikuru emitsioku. Yes, Mama, I speak truth. Simone's mother's eyebrows had shot up. You speak Igbo? Only a little, Sinho had admitted, switching back to English. But I will learn more. I want to know everything about Simone's heritage and culture. That had seemed to satisfy Simone's mother somewhat. She nodded slowly, then had pulled Simone aside for a quick, fierce hug. Are you okay? She'd whispered. Really okay? Because we can stop all this right now if you need us to. Simone had hugged her mother back, drawing strength from her presence. I think I need to see where this goes, Mama. That man who was supposed to marry you, Druce. He did something terrible, didn't he? Simone had nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her mother had pulled back, her eyes flashing with anger. Then he is not worth your tears or your thoughts. This man, Sinho, he looks at you like you are precious. That is something. Give it a chance. Now, standing outside the reception venue, Sinho had gestured toward the line of luxury vehicles. I thought we might drive to your apartment so you can pack some things for our honeymoon. Unless you prefer not to go, we can postpone. No, Simone had interrupted. I mean, if we're doing this, we should do it properly. Where are we going? Sinho's smile had been warm. The Bahamas. I have a private villa on Paradise Island. I thought you might enjoy the peace and privacy after such a tumultuous day. The Bahamas. A private villa. Simone had felt like she was living in some kind of fever dream. Sinho had walked her to the Rolls-Royce, and this time, when he'd taken her hand to help her into the car, he'd done something that had made her heart skip. He'd raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Thank you, he'd said softly, for taking a chance on me. The drive to Simone's apartment had been surreal. She'd sat in the back of a Rolls-Royce, still in her wedding dress, next to a man she'd married hours ago, but didn't know, processing the fact that her entire life had just changed in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Sinho had been quiet for most of the drive, seeming to sense that she needed space to think. But when they'd stopped at a red light, he'd spoken up. I want you to know something, he'd said, looking out the window rather than at her. What that man did to you today, Druce, it was cruel and unforgivable. I saw his face when you walked down that aisle. He was expecting you to run, to fall apart. The fact that you didn't, that you held your head high and made a choice that protected your dignity, that took incredible strength. Simone had felt tears threatening again. I felt humiliated. I know, Sinho had said, finally turning to look at her. But you didn't look it. You looked like a queen who refused to be conquered. It was inspiring. They'd arrived at Simone's apartment building then, and Sinho had helped her out of the car. Simone had been acutely aware of her neighbors watching from their windows as she'd entered the building with this strange man and his entourage. The gossip would be intense tomorrow. Inside her apartment, Simone had felt some of the surrealism fade as she'd found herself in her own space, surrounded by her own things. This was real. This was her life. And she'd just married a stranger who claimed to be a billionaire. I'll wait here, Sinho had said, gesturing to her living room. Take your time packing whatever you need. In her bedroom, Simone had finally been alone. She caught sight of herself in the mirror, still in her wedding dress. Her makeup somehow still intact despite everything, but her eyes showing every bit of the emotional exhaustion she felt. She pulled out her phone and found dozens of missed calls and text messages. Most were from concerned friends and family, but there was one from an unknown number that made her blood run cold. Congratulations on your marriage, Simone. Did you really think I'd let someone like you embarrass my sister without consequences? I hope you enjoy your life with that imbecile. You deserve each other. D. So it had been about his sister. About that night at the charity gala. Druce had put all of this together. Months of lies, of pretending to love her, of planning a wedding, just to get revenge for his sister's wounded pride. The cruelty of it took her breath away, but it also made her decision clearer. She wouldn't let Druce Hamilton's actions define her or destroy her chance at something real. If Sinho was offering her a genuine opportunity for a fresh start, for a relationship built on honesty rather than manipulation, then she owed it to herself to explore it. Simone had packed quickly, throwing clothes and toiletries into a suitcase. When she'd emerged from her bedroom in comfortable travel clothes, she found Sinho exactly where she'd left him, though he'd removed his ill-fitting suit jacket and was looking at the photos on her wall. Is this your family? He'd asked, pointing to a large photo of Simone with her parents and siblings, taken on a trip back to Nigeria a few years ago. Yes, Simone had said. That's my mother, my father, my brother Chike, and my sister Adiz. You have your mother's eyes, Sinho had observed. And her strength, I think. They'd made their way to a private airfield where Sinho's jet was waiting. An actual private jet. Simone had flown business class a few times for work, but this was another level entirely. The interior looked more like a luxury apartment than an aircraft, with plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and a staff that attended to their every need. As they'd taken off, Simone had stared out the window at Detroit growing smaller below them, wondering if her life would ever feel normal again. During the flight, Sinho had opened up more about himself. He'd told her about growing up in Seoul, about the pressure of being the only heir to a massive business empire, about his education at Harvard and MIT. He talked about his love of technology and innovation, his philanthropic work, his complicated relationship with his extended family. Money doesn't buy happiness, he'd said at one point. It buys comfort, security, opportunities, but not genuine connection. I've learned that the hard way. Simone had found herself sharing too, telling him about her childhood in Anambra, about immigrating to America to pursue her education, about building her career from nothing. She talked about the loneliness of being single in a culture that valued marriage and family so highly, about the pressure she'd felt from her relatives, about her own fears that she'd die alone. I thought Druce was my miracle, she'd admitted quietly. I thought God had finally answered my prayers. Maybe he did, Sinho had said, just not in the way you expected. They'd arrived at Paradise Island as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The villa Sinho had mentioned was actually an entire compound, with a main house, guest cottages, a private beach, and staff quarters. It was stunning, like something out of a magazine. That first night, Sinho had been incredibly respectful of Simone's boundaries. He'd shown her to the master suite, a beautiful room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, and had told her it was hers. He'd take one of the guest rooms. But Simone had surprised both of them by saying, "We're married. We can share the room. I need time for everything else." Sinho had nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We have all the time in the world." They'd fallen asleep that night in the same massive king-size bed, each staying carefully on their own side, listening to the waves crash against the shore outside. Over the next few days, something had begun to shift between them. Sinho had been attentive without being pushy, romantic without being presumptuous. He'd made her breakfast each morning. It turned out he was an excellent cook, having learned as a form of stress relief during his university years. He'd taken her snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters, had walked with her along the beach at sunset, had simply sat with her in comfortable silence when words felt like too much. He'd also been surprisingly funny, with a dry sense of humor that caught Simone off guard and made her laugh despite everything. He'd been sweet, leaving little notes for her to find, arranging flowers in her room, making sure she had everything she needed. But more than any of that, he'd been present, truly present. He'd listen when she talked, remember the details, asked thoughtful questions. He'd shared his own vulnerabilities, his own fears and dreams. And gradually, Simone had felt her guard beginning to lower. It was on their 5th night in the Bahamas that everything changed. They'd had dinner on the beach, a meal prepared by the villa chef but served privately, just the two of them under a canopy of stars. They'd talked for hours about everything and nothing, and somewhere in that conversation, Simone had realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling for her husband. When they'd returned to their room that night, Sinho had stopped at the door, turning to face her. "Simone," he'd said, his voice low and earnest, "I need you to know that regardless of what happens between us physically, you are already precious to me. These past few days with you they've been everything I hoped for and more. There's no pressure, no expectation. I just wanted you to know that." Simone had looked at this man who'd literally crashed into her life on what was supposed to be the worst day of her existence, and she'd made a decision. She'd reached up, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him. The kiss had been tentative at first, questioning, but when Sinho had wrapped his arms around her and pulled her closer, it had deepened into something more. By the time they'd finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Simone had known exactly what she wanted. "I'm ready," she'd whispered. "If you are." Sinho's eyes had searched hers. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." What happened next was tender and passionate, awkward and perfect. When Sinho had discovered that Simone was a virgin, at 53 years old, his eyes had widened in shock. "Why didn't you tell me?" he'd asked, pulling back. Would have changed anything? Simone had countered. Yes. No. I mean, Sinho had taken a breath. I would have wanted to make sure I did everything right. Simone had smiled, touched by his concern. You were doing everything right. He'd been incredibly gentle with her, patient and attentive, making sure she felt comfortable every step of the way. And when it was over, as they lay tangled together in the sheets, both of them breathing hard and grinning at each other like teenagers, Simone had felt something click into place inside her chest. Thank you, Sinho had whispered, pressing kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you for trusting me with this. With you. Simone had fallen asleep that night, wrapped in her husband's arms, feeling safer and more cherished than she ever had in her entire life. The next morning, she'd woken to find Sinho already up and the smell of something delicious wafting through the villa. She'd wrapped herself in a silk robe and padded out to find him in the kitchen, cooking up what looked like a feast. Good morning, Mrs. Park, he'd said with a grin when he'd spotted her. Mrs. Park, Simone had repeated, testing out the sound of it. I'm still getting used to that. Well, you'd better get used to it quickly, Sinho had teased. Because I plan on calling you that for the rest of our lives. He'd serve her breakfast in bed. Fluffy pancakes, fresh fruit, perfectly scrambled eggs, and the best coffee she'd ever tasted. While she ate, he disappeared and returned with several wrapped boxes. What's this? Simone had asked, eyeing the packages suspiciously. Gifts, Sinho had said simply. For you. Sinho, you don't need to buy me things. I know I don't need to, he'd interrupted gently. I want to. You gave me something incredibly precious last night. Let me thank you properly. The boxes had contained jewelry, not ostentatious pieces, but elegant, thoughtful selections. A delicate gold necklace with a pendant that incorporated both Korean and Nigerian design elements. Earrings with small sapphires that match her eyes. A bracelet engraved with both of their names in English, Korean, and Igbo. Sino? Simone had breathed, tears forming in her eyes. These are beautiful. You're beautiful, he corrected. These are just accessories. They'd spent the rest of their honeymoon in that blissful bubble, getting to know each other's bodies and hearts with equal intensity. Sinho had shown himself to be passionate and creative in bed, always attentive to Simone's pleasure. But more than the physical connection, it was the emotional intimacy that had truly bonded them. When it was finally time to leave the Bahamas, Simone had felt reluctant. The villa had been their sanctuary, a place where the outside world and all its complications couldn't reach them. But reality was waiting, and it was time to face it. Their first stop after returning to the States was Simone's parents' home in Anambra. Sinho had insisted on visiting them properly, wanting to pay his respects and formally introduce himself as their son-in-law. The flight to Nigeria had been long, but Sinho had made it comfortable, arranging everything in first class and making sure Simone had everything she needed. During the flight, he'd practiced his Igbo with her, determined to be able to communicate at least basically with her parents. When they'd arrived at her parents' modest home in Anambra, Simone had felt nervous. She hadn't told them much about Sinho, just that the wedding had been complicated, but that she was happy now. She had no idea how they'd react to the whole situation. But Sinho had won them over almost immediately. He'd greeted her father with a respectful bow, had complimented her mother on her home and cooking, and had presented them with thoughtful gifts, traditional Korean items, along with a donation to their local church in their name. It was on the second day of their visit that Sinho had really shocked everyone. He'd taken Simone's father aside for a private conversation, and when they'd emerged an hour later, her father had tears in his eyes. Papa, Simone had asked worriedly. What's wrong? Nothing is wrong, my daughter, her father had said, his voice choked with emotion. Your husband is a very good man. It wasn't until later that Simone learned what Sinho had done. He'd given her parents a brand new car to replace their aging vehicle that was constantly breaking down. But more than that, he'd arranged to have their entire house renovated and expanded. New plumbing, new electrical, new everything. He'd set up a trust fund to ensure they'd be comfortable for the rest of their lives. Sinho, that's too much, Simone had protested when they were alone. It's not enough, he'd countered. They raised you. They made you into the woman you are. I can never repay that, but I can make sure they're taken care of. But the visit to Anambra had also brought some complications. Simone's extended family had gotten wind that she'd married a wealthy man, and suddenly cousins she barely knew were coming out of the woodwork, visiting the house with thinly veiled requests for money and opportunities. One cousin in particular, a woman named Chioma, had been especially persistent. She was 28, beautiful, and clearly used to getting what she wanted from men. She'd shown up at the house in tight clothes and had proceeded to flirt shamelessly with Sinho, completely ignoring Simone's presence. "So, Sinho," Chioma had purred, leaning close to him during dinner one night. "I hear you own many businesses. Perhaps you need someone smart and beautiful to help you manage them? I have a degree in business, you know." Sinho had smiled politely, but had immediately taken Simone's hand on top of the table. "I'm sure you're very capable, Chioma. However, I already have more than enough staff. What I need most is my wife beside me. Everything else is just details." Chioma had pouted, but hadn't given up. Over the next few days, she'd made multiple attempts to get Sinho alone, to impress him with her youth and beauty, to plant seeds of doubt about Simone's age and worthiness. It had all come to a head one afternoon when Simone had gone to the market with her mother, leaving Sinho at the house. When they'd returned, they'd found Chioma in a compromising position. She'd spilled water on herself accidentally and had cornered Sinho, asking him to help her clean up, her wet blouse clinging to her body. Sinho had been standing at least 6 feet away from her, his arms crossed and his expression cold. The first time Simone had seen him look genuinely angry. "Chioma," he'd said, his voice like ice. "I'm going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. I am married to Simone. Not because of any obligation, not because of any deception, but because she is the woman I choose every single day. Your attempts to seduce me are not only disrespectful to your cousin, they're insulting to both of us. If you truly cared about Simone, you would celebrate her happiness, not try to destroy it out of jealousy." He'd paused, his eyes hard. "Furthermore, I've built my career on reading people, on seeing through false facades. You're not interested in me. You're interested in my money. And that makes you exactly the kind of person I've spent my entire life avoiding. I suggest you leave now, and I suggest you think very carefully about how you treat family members who have done nothing but show you kindness." Chioma had left in tears, and word had spread quickly through the extended family. After that, the opportunistic relatives had kept their distance, apparently deciding that Sinho wasn't the easy mark they'd assumed he'd be. Simone had been both embarrassed by her cousin's behavior and touched by Sinho's fierce defense of their marriage. That night, she'd thanked him, and he'd simply pulled her close. "You're my wife," he'd said simply. "Protecting you, honoring you, defending you. That's not some burden I've taken on. It's a privilege." After 2 weeks in Nigeria, they'd returned to Detroit, and that's when the real adjustment began. Sinho had a penthouse apartment in downtown Detroit that Simone had never even known existed, one of those ultra-luxury buildings where residents valued their privacy above all else. The penthouse was stunning, taking up the entire top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city and the river. It was decorated in a minimalist modern style that somehow still felt warm and inviting. "This is your home now, too," Sinho had told her as he'd given her the tour. "Change anything you want. Redecorate completely if that's what you'd like. I want you to feel comfortable here." Adjusting to life as the wife of a billionaire had been strange. Simone had always been independent, had always taken care of herself. Now she had staff, a housekeeper, a personal assistant, a driver. Sinho had insisted she didn't need to work if she didn't want to, that she could retire and focus on whatever made her happy. But Simone had loved her career. After some discussion, they'd compromised she'd continue working, but only on projects that genuinely interested her, and she'd cut back her hours significantly. It was during this adjustment period that Bruce Hamilton had started trying to crawl back into her life. His company had begun having serious problems. Simone had heard through the grapevine that several major deals had fallen through, that investors were pulling out, that he was facing potential lawsuits. Whether Sinho had anything to do with these problems, Simone didn't know and didn't ask. But the timing was certainly interesting. Drews had started calling her, leaving messages that she'd deleted without listening to. He'd shown up at her old apartment building, only to discover she'd moved. He tried contacting her through social media, through mutual acquaintances, any way he could think of. His messages had progressed from casual, "Hey, just wanted to check in," to desperate, "Please, Simone, I need to talk to you," to pathetic, "I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Please give me another chance." Simone had ignored them all. She'd moved on, found something real, and she had no interest in revisiting that particular nightmare. But Drews had been persistent. One day, about 6 weeks after the wedding, he'd managed to corner her outside her office building. Simone had been leaving work, thinking about what she and Sinho would have for dinner, when Drews had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Simone, please, just give me 5 minutes," he'd said, looking haggard and desperate. Simone had stopped, more out of shock than anything else. She hadn't seen him since the wedding, and the change in him was striking. He looked like he'd aged years in just weeks. Dark circles under his eyes, his expensive clothes rumpled, his legendary confidence replaced by obvious desperation. "What do you want, Drews?" she'd asked coldly. "I want to apologize," he'd said quickly. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I was angry about what you'd said to Melissa, and I wanted to hurt you, but I took it too far. Way too far. I am sorry, Simone. Truly sorry." "Your apology is noted and rejected," Simone had said, moving to walk past him. "Wait." He grabbed her arm, and Simone had immediately yanked it away. "Don't touch me. Please, Simone. I know I don't deserve it, but I need your help. My company is falling apart. Investors are abandoning me. Deals are collapsing. I think your husband might be behind it. And if he is," Simone had asked, "you try to destroy me publicly. Did you think there would be no consequences?" "I'll do anything," Drews had said desperately. "Please, just talk to him. Ask him to back off. I'll lose everything." Simone had looked at this man who had seemed so powerful, so in control just months ago, now reduced to begging. She'd felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sympathy. Just a vague sense of pity for someone who'd been so consumed by pettiness that he destroyed his own life. "Drews," she'd said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. You didn't lose me. You never had me. What you had was a fantasy you'd created, a game you were playing. And now you've lost your company not because of me or my husband, but because you were so focused on revenge that you neglected what actually mattered. That's not my fault. That's not my husband's fault. That's yours." She'd started to walk away, then had paused and turned back. "And Drews? Don't contact me again. I have a husband who actually loves me, who chose me not despite who I am, but because of it. I don't need your apologies or your problems. Move on with your life and leave me alone." Simone had walked to where her car and driver were waiting, leaving Drews standing on the sidewalk, looking defeated. When she'd arrived home and told Sinho about the encounter, she'd expected him to be angry or upset. Instead, he'd simply pulled her into his arms. "Are you okay?" he'd asked. "I'm fine," she'd assured him. "Better than fine, actually. I realized I don't feel anything for him anymore. Not anger, not hurt, nothing." "Good," Sinho had said, kissing the top of her head. "He's not worth your emotional energy." "Sinho," Simone had pulled back to look at him. Are you doing something to his company?" Sinho had met her gaze steadily. "Would it bother you if I was?" Simone had thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe. I don't want you doing anything illegal or unethical on my behalf." "Nothing illegal," Sinho had assured her. "And as for ethics, let's just say that when certain people in my network learned what Drews Hamilton had done to my wife, they became very interested in examining his business practices more closely. And it turns out, he hasn't been as honest in his dealings as he should have been. Sometimes the truth has consequences." Simone had decided not to push for more details. Whatever was happening to Drews was ultimately his own doing. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. Simone had continued working on projects that challenged and excited her. Sinho had been juggling his business responsibilities while making sure to be present in their relationship. They'd traveled together, explored each other's cultures more deeply, built a life together. Sinho's family had embraced Simone completely. His mother had taken her shopping, taught her Korean cooking, shared family stories and traditions. His father had treated her with respect and affection, clearly pleased that his son had found happiness. Even the extended family members who Sinho had warned her might be problematic had been welcoming, perhaps sensing that Sinho's new wife wasn't someone to be trifled with. But Chioma hadn't given up. She'd somehow gotten Sinho's contact information and had started messaging him directly, sending suggestive photos and messages about how she could show him a good time if he ever got tired of that old woman. Sinho had shown Simone the messages immediately, his disgust evident. Together, they crafted a response that had finally shut Chioma down. Chioma, the message had read, "This is the last communication you will receive from me. Your behavior is harassment, and if it continues, I will be forced to take legal action. Furthermore, since you seem to be struggling financially and professionally, I've arranged for a job opportunity for you in Lagos, a legitimate position with a reputable company, far enough away that you won't be able to continue bothering my wife or her family. Take it or don't, but either way, leave us alone." The job offer had been real. Sinho had contacts everywhere, and it had actually been a good position, far better than anything Chioma had been able to secure on her own. She'd taken it, perhaps finally realizing that trying to seduce Sinho was never going to work and that she might as well benefit from his generosity in a legitimate way. One evening, about 3 months into their marriage, Sinho had come home from work looking particularly pleased with himself. "Pack a bag," he'd announced. "We're going on an adventure." "Where?" Simone had asked, laughing at his enthusiasm. "You'll see." The next morning, they'd flown to Montana, where Sinho had rented a cabin in the mountains. They'd spent the day hiking up a trail that wound through pine forests and along mountain streams, Sinho holding Simone's hand and pointing out wildlife and talking about his dreams for their future. When they'd finally reached the summit, the view had been breathtaking, mountains stretching out in every direction, the sky impossibly blue, the air crisp and clean. "I wanted to bring you here," Sinho had said, wrapping his arms around Simone from behind as they stood looking out at the vista. "Because sometimes, when I'm dealing with all the noise and complications of business and life, I need to remember what really matters. Standing here, looking at all of this, it puts everything in perspective." Simone had leaned back against him, feeling overwhelmed by how much her life had changed, how unexpectedly happy she'd become. "I wish we had children," she'd said softly, the thought surprising even her as it emerged. "Is that crazy? We've only been married a few months, and I'm 53 years old. But standing here with you, I wish we could create a family." Sinho had been quiet for a long moment, then had turned her around to face him. His eyes had been shining with emotion. "It's not crazy," he'd said. "And Simone, there are options. Adoption, surrogacy, fertility treatments. If you want children, we can explore every possibility. Or if you'd rather it just be us, that's perfect too. I just want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Simone had kissed him then, standing on top of that mountain, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. "I love you," she'd said, the words coming easily now, naturally. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Sinho had responded, holding her tight. "More than I ever thought possible." They'd stood there for a while longer, just holding each other and looking at the world spread out below them, both of them thinking about the future and all its possibilities. Finally, as the afternoon sun had started to descend, they'd begun making their way back down the mountain. Sinho had been ahead of her on a narrow part of the trail, reaching back to help her over some rocks when they'd heard it. Music drifting up from somewhere below. Someone had a radio on, and the song floating through the mountain air was an old love song from the 80s. "Dance with me," Sinho had said suddenly, pulling Simone close on the narrow trail. "Here," Simone had laughed. "There's barely room to stand." "Here," Sinho had insisted, already swaying with her to the music. So they danced, there on the mountain trail, with the sun painting everything golden and the music providing a soundtrack to a perfect moment. Simone had rested her head on Sinho's chest, feeling his heartbeat, thinking that life had a funny way of working out. They'd finally made it back to their rental car as the sun was setting. Sinho had been driving, one hand on the wheel and one holding Simone's hand, both of them still grinning at each other like idiots. The radio was still playing love songs, and they'd been singing along, off-key and not caring. The song had just changed to something new, something upbeat and joyful, when Sinho had turned to say something to Simone, his eyes full of love and laughter, which is why he hadn't seen the car approaching from the side road. Everything had happened in slow motion and too fast all at once. The screech of tires, Sinho's shouted warning, the violent jolt as the other car had crashed into the passenger side, the explosion of the airbag, the sharp, searing pain in Simone's arm, the sound of glass shattering. And then gunshots, two of them, unmistakable cracks that had sent adrenaline flooding through Simone's system. Simone! Sinho had been yelling, his hands on her face, checking her for injuries. Simone, are you hurt? Talk to me. My arm, she gasped, looking down to see blood spreading across her sleeve. Sinho, I've been shot. His face had gone white. In one fluid motion, he'd assessed the situation. The car that had hit them was empty, its driver gone. The shots had come from somewhere in the trees. They were sitting targets. Sinho had thrown the car into reverse, the rental's tires squealing as he'd backed away from the wreck. He'd pulled out his phone with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel, calling someone and barking orders in Korean. Hold on, sweetheart, he told Simone, his voice tight with fear and fury. Just hold on. I'm getting you to a hospital. The drive had been a blur. Simone had pressed her hand to the wound on her arm, trying to slow the bleeding. The pain had been intense, but the fear had been worse. Not fear for herself, but fear about what this meant. Someone had deliberately crashed into them. Someone had shot at them. This hadn't been an accident. Sinho had driven like a man possessed, making the 40-minute drive to the nearest hospital in 25. By the time they'd screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, Simone had been feeling lightheaded from blood loss, and Sinho had been coated in her blood from where he'd kept reaching over to check on her. Hospital staff had swarmed them immediately, loading Simone onto a gurney and wheeling her inside. Sinho had tried to follow, but security had stopped him. He looked wild, dangerous, covered in blood and radiating violence. That's my wife, he'd roared. I'm not leaving her. A nurse had intervened, calming him down, explaining that he could come back once they'd stabilized her. In the meantime, he needed to let them work. The next few hours had been a nightmare of fluorescent lights, medical jargon, and the sharp sting of needles. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of Simone's upper arm. Painful and bloody, but not life-threatening. They'd cleaned the wound, stitched her up, pumped her full of antibiotics and pain medication. It was only after she'd been moved to a private room and the immediate crisis had passed that the doctor had come in with Sinho, who'd cleaned himself up but still looked haggard and terrified. Mrs. Park, the doctor had said, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. The good news is that the wound was relatively clean. You'll need physical therapy and time to heal, but you should make a full recovery. Thank God. Sinho had breathed, taking Simone's uninjured hand and bringing it to his lips. There's one other thing, the doctor had continued, glancing at her chart. We're in a full battery of tests, given the trauma you experienced. And we discovered something. Simone had felt her heart rate pick up. What? What's wrong? The doctor had smiled then, a warm, genuine smile. Nothing's wrong, Mrs. Park. In fact, I have wonderful news. You're pregnant. About 6 weeks along, based on the hormone levels. The baby appears to be fine, unaffected by the accident or the gunshot wound. But you'll need to follow up with an OBGYN as soon as possible for a full workup. The room had gone completely silent. Simone had stared at the doctor, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. What? She'd whispered. You're pregnant. The doctor had repeated, still smiling. Congratulations. Simone had turned to look at Sinho, and the expression on his face, shock, joy, wonder, love, had made tears spring to her eyes. We're having a baby, she'd said, her voice breaking. Sinho, we're having a baby. He'd carefully gathered her into his arms, mindful of her injury, and she'd felt his body shaking with sobs. Happy sobs, overwhelmed sobs, the kind of crying that comes when something you've wanted so badly you were afraid to fully hope for it suddenly becomes real. A baby, he'd kept repeating. We're having a baby. Simone, we're having a baby. The doctor had quietly excused herself, giving them privacy for this moment. And there, in that hospital room, with Simone's arm bandaged and both of them still processing the violence they'd just survived, they'd also received the most incredible gift. But even as they'd held each other and cried happy tears, a part of Simone's mind had been working on a darker question. Who had attacked them? And why? The crash could have been an accident, but the gunshots definitely weren't. Someone had tried to hurt them, or worse. As if reading her thoughts, Sinho had pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. I'm going to find out who did this, he'd said, his voice hard as steel. And I'm going to make sure they never threaten you or our baby ever again. Simone had nodded, believing him completely. But she'd also felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. Because whoever had attacked them hadn't just targeted Sinho or his wealth. They'd targeted both of them, together. Which meant someone out there saw their happiness, their love, their future as something that needed to be destroyed. The doctor had returned then, bringing more information about Simone's pregnancy, instructions for care, warnings about what to watch for. Through it all, Sinho had held Simone's hand, and she'd held his, both of them still processing this incredible, overwhelming, perfect development. A baby. After everything they'd been through, after the bizarre circumstances of their marriage, after finding real love in the most unexpected place, they were going to have a baby. But the question remained, hovering over them like a storm cloud. Who would try to kill them? And would they try again? The doctor had left them alone once more, promising to be back to check on Simone soon. In the quiet of the hospital room, with machines beeping softly and the sun setting outside the window, Sinho and Simone had sat together in a mixture of joy and fear, hope and worry. Oh, a nurse had said as she'd poke her head in to check the monitors, breaking the heavy silence. Mrs. Park, you're pregnant. How wonderful. Congratulations to you both. The simple enthusiasm in her voice had somehow made it feel more real, and Simone had found herself smiling despite everything. Despite the pain in her arm, despite the fear of whoever was after them, despite all the unknowns ahead. She was pregnant. She and Sinho were going to be parents. And as her husband had leaned down to kiss her forehead, whispering promises about protecting her and their baby no matter what it took, Simone had realized that whatever came next, they would face it together. End of episode 1. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss episode 2. Drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what you think will happen next. Will Simone and Sinho find out who attacked them? How will they protect their growing family? Find out in the next episode.